People think the hardest part about owning land is maintaining it. They're wrong. The hardest part is defending it from people who think they're entitled to it. I own a ranch on the edge of a growing community. Not a small one. Not something you accidentally wander into. It's a real, working ranch that's been in my family for generations. The kind of land where mornings are quiet, where fences actually mean something, and where gates exist for one simple reason: to keep what's outside from coming in. And right at the boundary between my land and a newly built HOA development, there's a gate. A solid metal ranch gate. Locked. Clearly visible. Clearly private. That gate had been there long before the HOA showed up with its paved roads, uniform houses, and rules about mailbox colors. Back when this area was still mostly open land, that gate marked where my family's responsibility began and where everyone else's ended. For a long time, there were no problems. The HOA residents stayed on their side. I stayed on mine. Occasionally someone would wave as they drove past the fence line. That was it. Peaceful, respectful. Then one morning, something felt off. I noticed fresh tire tracks cutting across the dirt near the gate. Not stopping, not turning around, just passing straight through my property like it was a public road. At first, I didn't panic. People get lost.
These are the
GPS
permits we
messes
filed
up.
last month.
Okay,
Someone
I
might
see.
have turned around in the wrong place.
So the
It
easement
happens.
covers
I
this section
smoothed
right
out the
here.
dirt and went on with my
This looks
day.
bad for us.
The next morning,
defendant
the
is
tracks
seen
were
here.
back. Same path.
Pause the video.
Same
I want
direction.
an explanation for this
Same
discrepancy,
confidence.
counselor.
That's when I started paying attention. Later that day, I saw it happen in real time.
You can't just
A
ignore
silver
the
SUV
contracts. It's
approached
gross
the gate from the
mismanagement.
HOA side. It slowed down just enough to look at the gate, then calmly drove around it. No hesitation, no confusion, no mistake. Straight onto my ranch. I stood there watching dust rise behind her tires, trying to process what I'd just seen. Because that wasn't an accident. That was a decision. The next day, I waited. I stood near the gate early in the morning, leaning against the fence, watching the road. Right on schedule, the silver SUV appeared again. I stepped forward and raised my hand. She stopped, rolled her window down halfway, didn't take off her sunglasses. "Yes," she said, like I was interrupting her day. "This is private property," I said, keeping my voice calm. "You can't drive through here." She looked past me at the land behind the gate, then back at me. "I live right there," she said, pointing toward the HOA houses. "I know," I replied, "and this is my ranch." She sighed, annoyed. "Everyone uses this road." "That doesn't make it public," I said. She smirked. "The old owner never had a problem with it." That sentence told me everything. People like her don't care about what's right. They care about what they've gotten away with before. "I'm not the old owner," I said, "and I do have a problem with it." Her smile vanished instantly. "So you're really going to block me?" she snapped. "Yes," I said. "That's why the gate exists." She shook her head slowly. "This is ridiculous." And then she did something that still makes my jaw tighten when I think about it. She drove forward. Around me. Around the gate. Onto my land. She didn't even look back. I stood there in silence, dust hanging in the air, realizing that politeness meant nothing to someone who believed rules were optional. That evening, I installed new signs. Not small ones. Not polite ones. Large, clear, impossible to miss signs. Private property, no trespassing, no through traffic. I figured that would end it. I was wrong. The next morning, she came back. Same silver SUV. Same route. Same speed. She didn't slow down this time. That's when I realized she wasn't confused. She was using my ranch as a shortcut. Every morning. Every evening. Cutting minutes off her commute by driving through land she didn't own and clearly didn't respect. It wasn't just annoying anymore. It was dangerous. This isn't a paved road. It's ranch land. There are animals, equipment, uneven ground. One wrong move and someone could get seriously hurt. And when that happens, guess who gets blamed? The landowner. So I started documenting everything. Dates, times, photos, videos. I installed a camera facing the gate. And the footage was even worse than I expected. Her SUV driving through without hesitation, sometimes speeding, sometimes swerving around the gate wider than before. Once, she even waved at the camera like she was daring me to do something. I contacted the HOA. I expected concern. Instead, I got excuses. She's lived here a long time. She's probably just used to it. Can't you be flexible? That word again. Flexible. People only ask you to be flexible when they want you to give up something that belongs to you. The final straw came one afternoon when I checked the camera feed and saw her stop at the gate. She got out of her car, grabbed the gate, and physically moved it aside so she could pass more easily. That wasn't ignorance. That wasn't habit. That was entitlement. Standing there, watching the footage, I realized something important. She didn't see a boundary. She saw an obstacle she expected to move. And if I didn't act soon, she was only going to push harder. Because people like that always do. There's a dangerous moment in conflicts like this. It's not the first time someone crosses a line. It's the moment they realize there are no consequences. And once that happens, everything changes. After I watched her physically move my gate on camera, I knew I couldn't pretend this was harmless anymore. This wasn't about convenience. It wasn't about a shortcut. It was about someone deciding my land didn't matter because stopping her would require effort. Still, I didn't react emotionally. That's important. People like her expect anger. They feed on it. They use it to paint themselves as victims. So instead, I got organized. Every morning and every evening, I checked the camera footage. I logged dates, times, how fast she drove, how wide she cut around the gate. I took photos of fresh tire marks and damage to the ground. I saved everything in a folder labeled clearly and calmly. Trespass documentation. I also upgraded the gate. Stronger lock, better hinges. Nothing dramatic, just enough to send a message. Or so I thought. The very next morning, the silver SUV showed up again. She slowed down, saw the reinforced gate, and paused. For just a second, I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd finally turn around. Instead, she backed up, swung wider than ever, and drove straight through the grass on the side of the gate, carving a new path like she was redesigning my land to suit herself. That's when I realized something uncomfortable. The gate wasn't stopping her. It was teaching her where the limits were, and she was pushing them on purpose. That afternoon, I decided to confront her one last time. Not to argue, to warn. I waited near the gate until evening. Sure enough, right on schedule, the silver SUV appeared, sunlight flashing off the windshield. I stepped forward and stood directly in front of the gate. She slammed on the brakes and rolled her window down aggressively. "What now?" she snapped. "This stops today," I said, steady and calm. "You are trespassing. I've documented everything. The HOA has been notified. If you drive through again, I'll take further action." She laughed. Actually laughed. "You can't seriously be this dramatic," she said. "I've been using this way for years. And you've been trespassing for years," I replied. "That doesn't make it legal." She leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You don't own the whole world." "No," I said. "Just this land." She shook her head in disbelief. "You know this is going to cause problems, right?" That sentence wasn't concern. It was a threat. "Then don't cause them," I said. She stared at me for a long moment, then did something subtle but revealing. She smiled. Not friendly, not apologetic. A smile that said she didn't believe I'd actually do anything. And then, without another word, she drove around the gate again, right in front of me. That was the moment politeness officially died. That evening, I sent a certified letter to the HOA board. Not emotional, not angry, just facts. I stated that a resident was repeatedly trespassing, that I had extensive video evidence, and that continued use of my property would result in physical barriers being installed and legal action taken if necessary. I gave them 1 week. Their response came 3 days later. Not from the board, from their attorney. The letter claimed the road had become an implied access route due to long-standing use by residents. They suggested we work toward a mutually beneficial solution and implied that blocking access could negatively impact the community. In other words, they weren't asking. They were testing. Testing to see if I'd fold under legal language and pressure. I showed the letter to my own attorney. He read it once, then smiled. "They don't have a case," he said. "But they think you won't push back." That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to argue anymore. I wasn't going to warn anymore. I was going to remove the option entirely. The next morning, I contacted the county. Permits, regulations, setbacks, everything by the book. Then I called a contractor, not for a fence, not for a bigger gate, for steel bollards, heavy industrial-grade steel posts designed to stop vehicles, the kind used to protect buildings and secure restricted areas. Deeply anchored, permanent. I didn't want something she could move. I wanted something that didn't care how entitled she felt. The contractor walked the site with me, measuring distances, checking angles. "Once these go in," he said, "no cars getting through here." "Good," I replied. We scheduled installation for early morning, before traffic picked up. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because the problem was solved, but because I finally stopped hoping someone else would fix it. Because when people show you they don't respect boundaries, believing they'll suddenly start is just wishful thinking. Sometimes the only way to protect peace is to make disrespect physically impossible. And she had no idea what was waiting for her at that gate the next morning. There's a special kind of silence right before something irreversible happens. That's what the ranch felt like that morning. The sun wasn't fully up yet. The air was cool, still holding on to the night. No engines, no birds startled, just quiet. The kind of quiet that tells you something is about to change. The contractors arrived just after sunrise. 2 trucks, heavy equipment, no HOA logos, no drama, just men doing a job. They walked the gate with me one last time, measuring, double-checking distances. The plan was simple but precise. The gate would remain functional for me, exactly as it always had been. But the open space around it, the space she had been abusing, would be sealed off permanently. Steel bollards, thick, solid, anchored deep into the ground with reinforced concrete. Not decorative, not flexible, not negotiable. As the drilling started, the sound echoed across the land. Metal biting into earth. Each hole marking the end of an assumption someone else had made about my property. I stood there watching, not smiling, not celebrating, just observing, because this wasn't about revenge. It was about finality. By mid-morning, the work was done. The gate stood where it always had. But now, on either side of it, stood immovable steel posts spaced perfectly so no vehicle could squeeze through. Wide enough for livestock safety. Narrow enough to stop entitlement cold. I walked the line once, checked the spacing, tested the gate. Perfect. I knew she'd come. She always did. Right on schedule, the silver SUV appeared at the far end of the road. Same speed. Same confidence. She slowed as she approached, probably already planning how she'd swing around the gate like she always did. Then she saw them. The bollards. You could see the confusion immediately. The hesitation. The moment her brain tried to process a reality that didn't include her usual shortcut. She stopped. Completely. The SUV sat there idling for a long second. Then she pulled forward slowly, trying to angle the car just right. She turned the wheel, inched closer, checked her mirrors. No gap. She reversed. Tried again. Nothing. The confidence vanished. She slammed the door open and stepped out, staring at the steel posts like they had personally offended her. "What is this?" she shouted, looking around until she spotted me standing near the fence. I didn't raise my voice. "It's a boundary," I said. "One you've ignored long enough." "You can't do this," she yelled, walking closer. "This is blocking access." "This is my land," I replied. "You never had access." She pulled out her phone immediately, started dialing, pacing, pointing at the gate, the bollards, me. "I'm calling the HOA," she snapped. "And the police." "You're welcome to," I said. She clearly expected panic. She didn't get it. Within 30 minutes, 2 HOA board members arrived. One of them I recognized from previous emails. The other looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. They walked the site, whispering to each other, glancing at the bollards like they were a crime scene. "This seems extreme," one of them finally said. "What's extreme?" I replied. "Is a resident repeatedly trespassing after being warned?" "Well, residents have been using this route for a long time," the other board member said carefully. I looked at him. "So have deer. That doesn't make it a road." They didn't laugh. They didn't argue either. Instead, they waited, because she'd called the police. When the patrol car arrived, the officer stepped out calmly, hand resting casually on his belt. He took in the scene: gate, bollards, SUV, angry woman, uncomfortable HOA reps. "What's going on?" he asked. She spoke first, of course. "He blocked a public access road," she said. "He can't do that." The officer turned to me. "Is this your property?" "Yes," I said, and handed him a folder I'd prepared weeks ago. Survey maps, deed, property boundaries. He reviewed them carefully. Then he looked at the gate, then the bollards, then back at the HOA board. "This appears to be private property," he said. She scoffed. "People have been driving through here forever." "That doesn't change ownership," the officer replied. She opened her mouth to argue again, but he raised a hand gently. "Ma'am," he said, "if you continue to attempt to enter this property, it could be considered trespassing." The word hit her hard. Trespassing. Her face went red. The HOA reps shifted uncomfortably. "This is going to cause problems," one of them muttered. I nodded. "It already has. I just finished it." They left shortly after. No citations. No orders. No demands to remove anything. Just silence. And a silver SUV turning around, forced, for the first time, to take the long way home. But that wasn't the end. Because when entitlement loses convenience, it looks for power. And the HOA had lawyers. 2 weeks later, I was served papers. They were suing, claiming obstruction, loss of access, property devaluation, emotional distress. Reading it, I felt something unexpected. Relief, because now everything would be decided somewhere that feelings didn't matter. Facts did, and facts were on my side. What they didn't realize, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that by pushing this into court, they weren't just challenging a gate. They were challenging ownership. And that was a fight they were never going to win. When the lawsuit arrived, I didn't feel angry. I felt calm. That's how I knew they had already lost something important. People assume going to court is about intimidation, about pressure, about making the other side nervous enough to give up. But courts don't run on entitlement. They run on paper. And I had a lot more paper than they did. The HOA's complaint was thick, dramatic, and emotional. They claimed I had unreasonably blocked a long-used access route, that my actions had disrupted the community, and that residents, specifically one, had suffered stress and inconvenience. They even argued that the bollards were aggressive. Aggressive. Steel posts standing quietly on my own land were somehow aggressive. My attorney read through the filing slowly, page by page. He didn't interrupt, didn't react. When he finished, he leaned back and smiled. "They're about to regret this," he said. The first phase was discovery. That's where things started to unravel. We requested HOA records, emails, meeting notes, internal communications related to the road, the gate, and my property. They tried to resist at first. The judge didn't allow it. And once those records started coming in, the truth came out in a way no one could spin. Emails between board members acknowledging that the land was private. Messages discussing how residents were technically trespassing. One email joking about how the ranch guy probably won't do anything. Another suggesting they delay action until I cool off. And then there were the messages about her. The silver SUV. Multiple complaints from other residents about her behavior. Her attitude. Her belief that rules didn't apply to her. One board member even described her as a liability. None of this was meant to be seen by a judge. But now it was. The day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was quiet, neutral, unimpressed by emotion. The HOA's attorney went first. He talked about community impact, convenience, how people had relied on that route. He tried to paint the Bollards as excessive, unnecessary, even hostile. Then it was our turn. My attorney didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He simply laid out the facts. Property ownership, survey boundaries, video evidence of repeated trespass, documented warnings, certified letters. Then he introduced the HOA's own emails. One by one, the judge leaned forward as they were read aloud. Emails acknowledging private ownership. Emails admitting residents knew they weren't supposed to use the road. Emails discussing strategy instead of solutions. The room shifted. The HOA board members stopped making eye contact. Then my attorney played the video. Footage of her driving around the gate, ignoring signs, physically moving the gate, waving at the camera. The judge paused the video, looked directly at the HOA's attorney. Was the board aware of this behavior? She asked. There was no good answer. He tried to say it was an isolated issue. The judge clicked to the next clip. Different day. Same behavior. Then another. Then another. Silence filled the room. When the judge finally spoke again, her tone was sharp and precise. Long-standing misuse does not create legal access, she said, especially when the owner has clearly objected. She dismissed their claim of obstruction, then dismissed the claim of damages. Then she did something the HOA wasn't prepared for. She allowed my counterclaim. Trespass, negligence, failure to control residents. Suddenly, the power shifted. What started as an attempt to force me to remove Bollards turned into a legal exposure they couldn't contain. After the hearing, the HOA's attorney requested a private discussion. Settlement talk. They wanted this over, quickly, but the damage was already done. News spread through the community. Residents learned the truth, that the road was never public, that the board knew it, and that their dues were now funding a losing legal battle. People were angry. Board meetings turned hostile. Questions were asked. Votes were demanded. Insurance providers reviewed the case and made a decision that hit the HOA harder than any ruling. They dropped coverage. Without insurance, the HOA was exposed. Legal fees piled up. Special assessments were proposed. Residents pushed back. Board members resigned. And quietly, almost unnoticed at first, the HOA began to collapse from the inside. As for her, the silver SUV stopped appearing. No more shortcuts. No more confidence. No more entitlement. She took the long way like everyone else. The Bollards stayed. The gate stayed. And my land stayed exactly what it had always been. Mine. But the story wasn't over yet. Because consequences don't stop at courtrooms. They ripple. And what happened next was something no one in that HOA ever expected. What most people don't understand about conflicts like this is that court isn't the end. Court is just the crack. The real damage happens afterward, when reality starts leaking into everyday life. After the hearing, I went back to my ranch and returned to routine. Feeding schedules, fence checks, quiet mornings. The land didn't care about lawsuits or HOAs. It just existed the way it always had. But on the other side of the gate, everything was changing. Slowly at first, then all at once. The HOA tried to keep things quiet. They sent out carefully worded emails to residents, talking about ongoing legal matters and asking for patience. They avoided specifics, avoided blame, avoided admitting they'd been wrong. That didn't work. Residents talk. Someone shared the court documents. Someone else posted screenshots of the emails that had been entered into evidence. The same emails where board members admitted the road was private, where they joked about waiting me out, where they acknowledged the risk and ignored it anyway. Once those emails made the rounds, trust evaporated overnight. At the next HOA meeting, the room was packed. Not with polite homeowners asking about landscaping, with angry people demanding answers. Why are we being sued? Why are our dues paying for this? Why did you lie about the road? The board tried to control the room. They couldn't. People shouted. Fingers pointed. Accusations flew. One resident stood up and said something that stuck. This isn't about a road. This is about you deciding rules don't matter when it's convenient. That sentence landed hard. Because it was true. The board president resigned 2 days later. Then the treasurer. Then another board member followed. The HOA tried to replace them quickly, but no one wanted the position. Why would they? The HOA was bleeding money, trust was gone, and the legal exposure wasn't finished. And then the insurance decision became public. The HOA's insurer officially withdrew coverage related to the case. No coverage meant no protection. Every mistake now came out of pocket. Lawyers started asking for retainers up front. Special assessments were proposed to cover costs. That's when things got ugly. Residents who had never used the road were furious they were being charged for it. People who barely knew about the gate were suddenly paying for someone else's entitlement. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Board meetings became arguments. Emails became hostile. The HOA wasn't managing a community anymore. It was trying to survive itself. Meanwhile, the silver SUV had disappeared completely. Not just from the gate. From the neighborhood. I heard later, through a contractor who lived nearby, that she'd stopped attending meetings, stopped responding to messages. People blamed her openly. Some defended her at first, but even that faded when the financial consequences became real. Shortcuts are easy to defend until they cost you money. One afternoon, I noticed something new. Someone had placed cones near the road on the HOA side. Temporary barriers. Not to block access, to redirect traffic. They were finally doing what they should have done from the beginning. Building around reality instead of fighting it. A week later, I received another letter from the HOA's attorney. This one sounded very different. No threats. No demands. Just a request to discuss resolution. They wanted to negotiate. They wanted me to remove the bollards. They offered vague promises of community cooperation and future communication. I read the letter once, then set it aside, because the truth was simple. I didn't need anything from them. The gate was doing its job. The land was peaceful again. Livestock wasn't being disturbed. No tire tracks. No dust clouds. No disrespect. Why would I undo that? Still, I knew this wasn't over. Because organizations don't collapse quietly. They flail. And when people lose control, they often make their worst decisions. A few days later, I woke up to something I hadn't seen in months. Fresh tire tracks. Not past the bollards, but right up to them. Someone had driven to the gate late at night and stopped inches from the steel posts. No damage. No attempt to break through. Just marks. Like a warning. Or a message. I checked the camera footage. The SUV wasn't silver this time. Different vehicle. Different driver. Someone testing. Someone angry. Someone who still didn't accept the boundary. That's when it hit me. The problem was never just her. She was just the loudest example. What I was dealing with was a mindset. The belief that convenience overrides ownership. That pressure creates rights. That if you push hard enough, boundaries eventually bend. And now that the HOA was unraveling, that mindset didn't disappear. Scattered. Uncontrolled. Which meant the next phase of this story wasn't about lawsuits or gates. It was about what happens when people realize rules are real and decide to challenge them anyway. And that was coming sooner than anyone expected. There's a big difference between conflict in daylight and conflict that happens quietly, when people think no one is watching. After I found those fresh tire marks near the bollards, something changed in the air around the ranch. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. But it was there. A tension that hadn't existed before. Before, the problem had a face. A silver SUV. A single person. Clear entitlement. Now it felt spread out. Anonymous. And that's always more dangerous. I reviewed the camera footage from that night carefully. The vehicle slowed near the gate, headlights cutting across the fence line. It didn't try to push through, didn't touch the bollards, just stopped long enough to make a point, then turned around and left. Whoever it was wanted to be seen, not caught. That told me this wasn't random. It was resentment, the kind that builds when people lose something they think they deserved. The HOA was still technically operating, but barely. Board meetings were chaotic. Residents were arguing publicly. Emails leaked almost daily. People blamed each other, the former board, the lawyers, and quietly me. I became the convenient villain, the difficult landowner, the guy who wouldn't compromise. The reason things got complicated. Never mind that all I did was protect my property. People don't like consequences. They like someone to point at. I didn't engage. That's important. I didn't post online. I didn't attend meetings. I didn't argue with neighbors. I stayed on my land, kept records, and upgraded security. More cameras, better angles, clear night vision. If someone wanted to test boundaries again, I wanted it documented. A week later, it happened. Just after midnight, the camera alert went off on my phone. Motion near the gate. I pulled up the feed and saw two figures standing near the bollards. They weren't trying to force anything. They were inspecting, pointing, talking. One of them kicked dirt near the base of a post, testing stability. Then they left. The next morning, I found scratches on one bollard. Superficial, but intentional. That was the line. This wasn't about access anymore. This was about defiance. I contacted the county sheriff's office and shared the footage. Not to accuse, to document, to establish a pattern. They took it seriously. Keep recording, one deputy told me. This is exactly how things escalate if no one pays attention. 2 nights later, someone tried again. This time, they brought tools. The footage showed a truck pull up slowly, lights off. Someone stepped out carrying what looked like a crowbar. They approached one bollard, tested it, realized immediately it wasn't going anywhere. Steel anchored deep doesn't flinch. Frustration set in. They slammed the tool against the post once, twice, then stopped, stood there, and did something I didn't expect. They spray-painted the gate. Nothing graphic, just a message. This isn't over. When I saw it the next morning, I didn't feel fear. I felt confirmation. Boundaries were working. Because when boundaries work, people who hate them get louder. I reported it, cleaned it, documented everything. The sheriff increased patrols near the area. Quietly. No sirens. No announcements. And that's when something interesting happened. The HOA panicked. They sent out emergency emails telling residents not to approach my property, not to interact, not to take matters into their own hands, which told me everything. They knew. They just couldn't control it. Residents were now acting independently, angry, embarrassed, financially stressed, and looking for someone to blame. I overheard a conversation at a local supply store a few days later. 2 men talking about the gate. One said, "He thinks he owns everything." The other replied, "He does." That's the problem. That sentence stuck with me, because it perfectly captured the mindset behind all of this. Not that I didn't own the land, but that ownership itself was offensive to people who wanted convenience. Late one evening, I received a call from the HOA's attorney again. Different tone. Again. This time almost nervous. He asked if I'd be willing to meet, not to negotiate removal of the bollards, but to discuss security concerns. In other words, things were getting out of their control. I agreed to meet, but not on my land. We met at a neutral office. He explained that the HOA was facing internal threats, vandalism, infighting, potential dissolution. He implied that some residents blamed me directly and that emotions were high. I listened quietly. Then I said something he wasn't prepared for. "I'm not responsible for managing your community." Silence. "My responsibility ends at my fence line," I continued. "Everything beyond that is your problem." He nodded slowly, because he knew I was right. That meeting didn't resolve anything, but it clarified something important. This wasn't going to end with apologies or agreements. It was going to end with a breaking point, because communities built on entitlement don't adapt well when rules finally apply. They fracture, and fractures always lead to one last, desperate attempt to regain control. I didn't know when it would come, but I knew it would. And when it did, it would decide everything. The breaking point didn't come with shouting. Came quietly. That's usually how the last act begins. By this point, the ranch felt different at night. Not unsafe, just alert. Like the land itself was waiting. Cameras were active. Patrols passed occasionally. The gate stood firm, framed by steel bollards that hadn't moved an inch since the day they were installed. Weeks had passed since the vandalism. No new messages. No fresh tire marks. No confrontations. That's what worried me most. Because when people stop reacting emotionally, it usually means they've made a decision. The final incident happened just before dawn. The camera alert woke me up at 4:12 a.m. Motion at the gate. I opened the feed immediately. A pickup truck sat just outside the fence line. Engine off. Lights off. Two figures stepped out. One of them I recognized instantly, not clearly, not by face but by posture. The silver SUV woman. She was back. This time she wasn't alone. They walked up to the gate, whispering, pointing at the bollards, at the hinges, at the fence line farther down where the terrain dipped slightly. They had a plan. And it was a bad one. The man with her carried bolt cutters. That was the moment I called the sheriff. Not after. Not later. Right then. While I stayed on the line, I watched them move toward the fence instead of the gate. They weren't trying to remove the bollards anymore. They were trying to go around everything. Cut the fence. Create a new path. That told me something important. This wasn't about access. This was about refusing to lose. The deputies arrived faster than I expected. Lights off until the last second. When they turned them on, the entire scene froze. Red and blue washed over steel, wire, dirt, and two very surprised people holding tools they couldn't explain away. There was no arguing this time. No yelling. No claims of misunderstanding. Trespassing. Attempted property damage. Evidence on camera. The woman started crying. Loudly. Angry tears. She shouted about unfairness. About how this had ruined everything. About how it never should have gone this far. One of the deputies looked at her and said something that ended the story better than anything I ever could. "It didn't go far," he said. "You did." They were escorted off the property. Charges were filed. And just like that, it was over. Not with drama. With paperwork. The HOA dissolved 3 months later. Not officially at first. Just functionally. No quorum. No leadership. No insurance. No money anyone wanted to manage. The county eventually stepped in to handle shared maintenance. The development became what it should have been all along. Just a neighborhood. Not a private government. Not a pressure machine. As for her, I heard she moved. Sold the house at a loss. No goodbye. No apology. Just gone. The gate never changed. The bollards never moved. And the ranch returned to silence. One evening, months later, I stood by the fence watching the sun dip low over the land. No cars. No dust. No tension. Just space. That's when it hit me. This story was never about a gate. It was about what happens when people confuse convenience with rights. When they mistake patience for weakness. When they believe that if something has been allowed long enough, it must belong to them. Boundaries don't exist to provoke conflict. They exist to prevent it. But when someone keeps crossing them, eventually the boundary has to stop being a request. It has to become reality. Steel doesn't argue. Paper doesn't negotiate. And ownership doesn't care how loudly someone disagrees with it. I didn't install those bollards to win. I installed them to end something that never should have started. And in the end, they worked. Because the strongest lesson in all of this wasn't taught with words. It was taught with consequences. And once those arrived, even the loudest entitlement finally went quiet.